Someone actually greeted me when I came in this morning, and they said, that's not surprising they greeted me, that's not what I'm saying. They greeted me by saying, so this is your last few hours with us. Am I in death row? Is there some, threat to my life? How should I take that? They meant well, I'm sure. But yes, final time in this pulpit for a while, at least until I'm invited back as a guest, if that ever happens, Pastor Godso, So I'd like to, say that, well, I guess I have to say some words this afternoon too. But it's been a privilege to be here and to get to know you all, or those I got a chance to know. It's such a big church, and it's frustrating, quite frankly. I know for all the pastoral staff too, as you work in a large church, there's so many people you see smiling, and you pass them by and you shake their hands and you wish you had a chance to get to know them. That's one of the dangers and challenges of a large church like this. And more about that this afternoon. Let's go back 2,000 years. And we're going to go back and meet a girl by the name of Miriam, a young girl about 12 or 13 years of age, and she's espoused to an older man whose name is Yosef. And contracts have been signed, gifts have been exchanged, and the wedding plans are in motion. In fact, a new addition on the groom's family home is taking shape. And then Yosef is stunned to learn that she is pregnant. And to make matters worse, instead of admitting her adultery, she is claiming that God gave her the child. Nobody believes such nonsense. Who would believe such nonsense? Never happened before. And she seemed like such a wonderful, pious girl, right? But she's clearly wicked or crazy or both. So what should he do? He could have her stoned. It was his right under Jewish law at the time. He could simply file a complaint, and the evidence is for all to see. And certainly he didn't do it, so he can have her stoned to death. That was his right. But you know what? He's hurt. He's been wounded, but he's not a cruel man. And so he says he wants to divorce her quietly, privately. So the Jewish law allowed him to gather together 2 or 3 witnesses, and in their presence, he would simply swear out an affidavit, so to speak, and that would be the end of it. The contract would be dissolved, the marriage would be over, and he would go and find someone else. She, of course, would be an outcast for the rest of her life. In fact, she would have no option except prostitution. She would have to support herself in some way. But then you see an angel appears to him, and he learns that she was telling the truth. I mean, if an angel tells you and appears in your room at night full of glory and power, well, you kind of believe it, don't you, I didn't believe you until Gabriel showed up and told me that you were telling me the truth. And he says, as angels always did, don't be afraid. They were a little overwhelming, when they appeared to you. But he says, don't be afraid for another reason as well, because he says, Yosef, your future is in God's hands. So don't worry about your reputation. You see, by not divorcing her publicly, he'd be declaring that he was the father of this child. Publicly, he was saying that he failed. And so by not divorcing her, he was taking responsibility. And his reputation would be ruined as well as hers. And so tongues would wag, people will talk, and boy did they talk. Jesus was considered all his life as an illegitimate child born of lust between 2 people who couldn't control themselves. In later years, Jewish writers would claim that actually Jesus was the product of rape. In the Talmud and other Jewish writings, they would say that actually it was a Roman soldier who raped Mary, and then she made up this ridiculous story. Obviously, the girl couldn't take it, and she had a breakdown of some sort. What nonsense that God would use such a man from that union to be his Messiah. It makes no sense. How absurd. So the shame followed him all his life of his beginnings that nobody would believe unless an angel showed up in their bedroom. But you see, God's grace is poured out on the outcasts, on the needy, the unworthy, the humble. That's the way God chooses to operate. Those who know their need and know where they stand and who they are, those are the ones that God can reach out to and pour on His grace. And so, in announcing this incredible miracle to the world, He chooses two groups of people who are despised and outcasts to announce the birth of His Son, who will be an outcast his whole life. He chooses dirty, despised sheep herders who were considered so low in social station that they were not allowed to give testimony in court. They were considered inherently, dishonest. As one writer puts it, they had a penchant for mistaking other people's property as their own. So why would God choose these people to be the witnesses who told the whole town of Bethlehem that the Messiah had been born? But He also chose another group of people, pagan astrologers. Would you go to pagan astrologers for any information whatsoever, except maybe a laugh? Right? Well, God chose them, these magi, and brought them into the land to proclaim the news of the birth of Jesus. Incredible, isn't it? Instead of going to the high-born teachers of the law, instead of going to people who were known as pious individuals, high in stature, who would be listened to by the people, He went to the very people that nobody wanted to hear and listen to, nobody would respect. God's powerful grace goes well beyond simply reaching out to the outcast, but God's grace also even transformed people's mistakes, their sins, and even their high-handed rebellion into good. Shame is covered, then woven by God into glory. What else are we going to make of the fact that God, through Israel's history, has used flawed, broken people to accomplish His purposes in spite of themselves? You want a few obvious examples? Well, how about Joseph's brothers? Out of bitter jealousy, they decide to dispose of him. Let's murder our brother, and then we'll have tea, What did they say? Let's kill the arrogant brat. But in the end, they said, you know what? We can actually turn a profit and get rid of him. It's a win-win situation here. So they sold him off to some travelers, and off he went to Egypt into slavery. So Joseph ends up in Egypt, and through God's grace and glory and providential power, Joseph, and let me add this also, through God's sense of irony, Joseph becomes the instrument that saves the brothers who tried to kill him. Joseph becomes God's instrument to save the very family that had disowned him and save all of Egypt from death in the coming famine. God used their rebellion, He used their evil, and what did He do? Maybe Satan thought that, I'm destroying God's covenant people and I am ruining this family, and that'll be the end of God's purposes for them. But what does God do? He takes their very evil and He twists it and turns it around, and He brings good out of it. That's the grace and power of God in action. And then you have the case of Jonah. We all know the story of Jonah, at least part of it, right? He runs from God's will, runs from God's call, refusing to do God's will, resisting the call to preach to the hated Assyrians, the enemies of his people. The call comes to Jonah and says, I want you to go to Nineveh, to the Assyrians, and preach to them and tell them and warn them that disaster is coming upon them unless they change and repent. And Jonah says, you've got to be kidding. Let them burn. I hate those people. And he did. They were the enemies of his people. They'd come in and raided and taken captives. They'd stripped the land of wealth. They'd done terrible things. And Lord, I want to see them punished. They deserve it. I want them destroyed. In fact, you want me to go to Nineveh? I'm going, that's far east. I'm going to go far west. And he goes down to the port of Joppa, and he gets in a ship. Where are you going? No, not far enough. Where are you going? Not far enough. Where are you going? That's the farthest place that I know about. Okay, I'll go there. And off he goes. And total rebellion against God and denial of his call, he takes that ship and he goes. But you see, God is not finished with him. And he meets him in a storm, saves his life in quite a spectacular way. And along with him, he saves a shipload of pagan sailors. Now, would they ever have known about God if it wasn't for Jonah's rebellion? God uses even his high-handed rebellion to bring about good things for people. And then Jonah, of course, finally finds himself back there, and apparently he had talent, And in spite of his reluctance, he's a blessing to thousands of people as they listen to his words. Here's a man who was rebelling against God, refusing to do the right thing, and God still used him to bless people and still work through his actual acts of rebellion to bring salvation to people. Incredible, isn't it? The kind of God that we serve that actually works through even our mistakes and failures and even our rebellion and brings good things to people's lives. Let's go to the New Testament to Saul the Pharisee. He was a highly educated fanatic. Okay? He was educated under the highest teacher, the best professor of the age, Gamaliel. But he was a jihadist, okay? He would, if he was around today, he'd probably join ISIL, right? That's him. And he murdered Christians in the name of God and thought he was doing God's will by killing Christians. He hunted them down in their houses, dragged them out, and had them put to death. And yet God says, I love him, and I'm going to use him. And so along the way to Damascus, what does he do? He knocks him off his horse and speaks to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Who are you? I'm Jesus whom you're persecuting. And this Paul, who becomes Saul, becomes the greatest Christian missionary in history. He is transformed by grace into a new creation. One incident in that also highlights the role that we as fellow Christians have to play in people's lives like that. You see, because it wasn't just God knocking off his horse. Because Saul, as he was blinded, instead of going ahead of a band of soldiers into the city of Damascus, is led blinded by the hand into the city. And there he's taken to a certain Christian brother by the name of Ananias. And Ananias doesn't want to meet Saul at first. He knows what he's like. But God brings him to Saul, and he says two words that really change his life. Brother Saul. Calling a person like that brother. You see, that's the miracle of God's grace. He changes the way we see people. He changes relationships. And he changes us into that we're a group of people disunited with different backgrounds and histories and lives, and brings us into Christ, into one body. That's his grace in action. And so the hated Pharisee full of hatred, becomes Brother Paul, greatest missionary through the grace of God, because God makes him into a new creation. You see, God can take our failures, our rebellions that are celebrated by Satan. He says, look what I made him do. Look what I got him to do. Look what has happened because of that he listened to me. And then God says, wait and see. And he takes those failures, those disasters, those problems, and he weaves them into his plan, bringing good out of evil, success out of failure, glory out of shame. Miriam and Yosef, Mary and Joseph, as we know them, of course, shamed, despised, outcast, are but the end of a line of shameful, broken people, outcasts that God included in his plan for the salvation of the world. Let's spend a few moments uncovering a few more examples of God's grace in people's lives in a very unlikely place. What I used to call as a kid, we used to call them the begats, right? The genealogy of Jesus found in Matthew's gospel. Now, it's not the place where you expect to find examples of grace, but here it is. Turn with me, if you would, to Matthew chapter 1. Now, who is Matthew, by the way, who's writing this? He was a tax collector, but more than that, you see, because if you became a tax collector, you were seen as a traitor, right? You sold out your own people. You got money from your own people and gave it to the hated Romans. So he was a traitor first and a tax collector second. And he was the target of assassination attempts. If you were a tax collector, you were marked for death. Okay? But here he is speaking of God's grace because he himself has been included in Jesus' inner circle of 12 disciples. And of course, that would have turned a lot of people away from Jesus, just knowing that a former tax collector is one of his 12. And so Matthew, writing this story, it's filled with grace. He has experienced grace, you see. So he includes in his genealogy something would never be included in any Jewish genealogy. It's totally unusual. Even Luke, that gives a parallel genealogy, doesn't do what Matthew does. And what does Matthew do? He includes the name of some women. Okay, so what? Well, why does he do it? Because, well, we'll see. What's his purpose in doing this? And instead of including women that you might say, if you had to choose 4 women to include, who would you include? Maybe Sarah, Rebecca, right? Rachel, maybe Leah. But instead, Matthew chooses 4 embarrassments. Okay? Why them? Of all people, why them? Well, let's take a look at those 4 that are mentioned in Matthew's genealogy before he ever gets to Mary. Let's read verses 1 to 3. This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. And why is he going through all this? Why have genealogies, by the way? Because it was establishing Jesus' credentials. He had to be of the family of Abraham. He had to be of the family of David, or he could never be in fulfillment of the prophecies of the Messiah. So you have to establish his credentials here. And so Matthew is doing so. But along the way, he includes this in verse 3. Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar, or Tamar. Who was Tamar? Why mention her? You see, we meet this lovely lady as she tries to outwit her father-in-law by posing as a prostitute and ends up having an incestuous affair with her father-in-law, Judah. And she also happened to be a Canaanite, not even of the tribe. So why on earth would you mention her? Oh yes, she was also, whose mother was Tamar. Remember that whole story? They knew it well, of course. It's one of those family secrets that we all have family secrets, things that you don't want to talk about, right? Why would you highlight the problems and embarrassments and mistakes, things that bring the family shame? But Matthew decides to highlight this incident of shame. In verse 5, we're introduced to the second woman here, Solomon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Why mention her? It's not necessary. Who was Rahab? She was a prostitute and a Canaanite. Which one was worse in their eyes, I'm not sure. Right? So there she is thrown in. Oh yes, let's remember Rahab. And the third one, again in verse 5, Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Oh, Ruth was a good woman, wasn't she? That's a good example. Finally, we have someone in there that we can actually say, well, there's someone you can preach on, right? Someone, a good example. But here's the problem. She is from Moab, and Moab was sworn enemies of Israel, and God gives them special mention for judgment. And the law stated, the Jewish law said that no descendant of Moab could be part of Israel for at least 10 generations. And yet God, through Ruth, gave us David. Interesting, isn't it? God seems to overwrite our rules that separate to bring people together. So that's 3 out of 4. In verse 6, we have the fourth one here. And Jesse, the father of King David. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. Now, he doesn't even give her name, does he? He doesn't say Bathsheba, but he says, you remember that whole story with, how he murdered Uriah and took his wife to himself after getting her pregnant, Do you remember that whole story? It's like he's rubbing it in their faces, right? The whole story of murder, deceit, terrible things happened, right? Why on earth is Matthew doing all this? Because Matthew in this is showing how God takes broken people and broken lives and then weaves them into his plan for salvation. He takes people whose lives are a mess and disorder, who don't see any possible future or hope for themselves, and what does he do? He weaves them into his plan. That's the kind of God we serve. Matthew reveals the kind of God that we serve, one who enters into history, taking our shame and failures upon himself, one who pours his grace upon those who have no future, no hope, no right to stand before him, and then he gives them that right. And one who takes our broken lives and creates something beautiful out of our failures. There is a danger here wrapped in irony. You know, those who grow up in the church, those who live well-ordered lives, who have never felt loss and despair, will lack the capacity to understand grace. It's just the way it is. If we've never felt lost, alone, and broken, we'll never understand grace for what it is. And the temptation of such people who think their life is all together, everything has happened the way it should, everything in their life is in order, they keep all the laws, they know all the rules, they've lived by them, and they can look around and say, well, and the temptation is to despise those who are broken, despise those who are not living up to their ideas of sanctification. The temptation is to despise the weak and the foolish. And so people like this who grow up without any of the struggles that other people have, people who don't face the same problems, who have not been broken like that, often focus on little things, legalistic details, and miss the glory of the gospel. And they will fight over such things as, well, the date of Christmas and whether you should eat cheese and whether it's okay to play chess or checkers and a whole host of other things. People that will argue and fight and condemn people on such little things and miss the glory of the gospel because they think they've got it all together. Oh, yes, they've got some little issues, but God has given them victory over those things. And why can't that person or that person get their head on straight? Why can't they simply surrender to God and let God deal with it? Because after all, if they're really Christians, they would know better. But those who have felt shame and regret, who are wounded and then healed, can see grace as solid, as real, as tangible, as potent, because it's a reality in their lives that they have experienced. They know where they've been, and they know where they are. That reality is reflected in a simple, almost comic parable that Jesus gives us in Luke chapter 18. Now I wonder if Jesus, he highlighted a few extra details to make it all the more stark. Do you really get a person like this? Luke chapter 18. Again, a sense of divine irony here in this parable. Luke 18, 9-14. To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed. You know what? He wasn't going to contaminate himself with any of those impure people over there. So he got himself away from people so he would not become unclean. And there he prayed, it says, to himself. Because the focus of his prayer was on his own record of his own good works, right? He thought he was praying to God, but he's really saying, God, look at how wonderful I am, right? And it was all clothed in thanksgiving. That's a cruel irony. The Pharisee stood by himself and he prayed, God, I thank you that I'm not like other people. I hope there's nobody actually like this, back then. Robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this guy over here. Every time I look at him, I can't help but think, I can't stand this guy. What is he even doing in church? in the synagogue, What is he doing here in the temple? And Lord, remember what I do for you? I fast twice a week. I've got perfect self-control after all, right? I give a tenth of all I get. I'm a self-sacrificing kind of guy. But the tax collector stood at a distance. I'm not worthy to be among these holy people. And he would not even look up to heaven, but he beat his breast and he said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. He knew precisely what his need was and where he stood, and the fact that he's completely and absolutely relying on God for everything that he had and everything that he was. God, be merciful unto me. And his sins were before him, and he knew it. And he says, I tell you that this man, Jesus says, this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. That story is John Newton's story. You know the story? He was a rebel who hated his father, and after his mother died, he ran away from his hard father, and he went away to sea. He found a position on some sort of freighter of some sort, but he became so nasty in his personality, he was so miserable as a person that finally they said, get off the boat. And he found himself actually on a Royal Navy ship. And there in a Royal Navy ship, well, you know what he said? In later years, he said, I made it my mission in life to sin as much as possible. I made it my mission in life to commit every sin there is known to man. And so he did that. And finally, the Royal Navy said, you're too nasty for us. The Royal Navy was full of very nasty characters, you know. Too much for us. And so he found himself actually eventually marooned on an island, but not until after he had actually been a slaver involved in the slave trade. He descended as far as he could go, and to the point where he became, as he says, a slave to other slaves, abandoned and marooned on an island. His father was still looking for him, and finally word came where he was, and so a friend actually picked him up off that island, and on his way home, there was a storm, a bit like Jonah this way, you know. And the storm was such that he felt there was no chance that he himself would ever survive. The ship was breaking up. As far as he could see, there was no hope for the ship itself. And in that moment of desperation, he says, God, I give myself to you. If you save me, he bargained with God, if you save me, I'll become a minister. Yes, might as well throw everything in there, right? He was all in this gamble in his life. And so I'll become a minister. Well, guess what? God did save his life, and he was brought back to England. Now, it's not simply a wonderful tale of redemption after that because he had his ups and downs and he had his struggles. You don't simply become a new person overnight. And some aspects of his life he was not proud of, but he was moving on the upward way. And eventually he kept his promise and became a minister of the gospel. And he wrote many hymns, one of which, of course, we'll sing at the end of this service. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. I was blind, but now I see. This was John Newton's story. Because for him, grace was tangible, it was real, because he knew that he was lost and that he was found. And so because grace was so real, it changed his life. If grace is not real to us, we cannot treat other people gracefully. If we have not experienced it as a real, tangible thing in our own lives, why would we be able to give it to anybody else? We'll always come across as condescending and arrogant towards those in need and those who are failing. But he was lost. He was truly a wretch. God saved a wretch like me. And that story, John Newton's story, was, again, Paul the Apostle's story. He was the hard-hearted Pharisee with the highest education and credentials, and he had an iron will. This is also a danger, for some Christians. Some Christians out there, they're scary people to me, quite frankly. They have an iron will. If you tell them, God says you should not do this, they say, fine, I'll never do it again. End of story. And they will never do it again. They can order their lives in a perfect way according to all the rules and regulations. Some people have that incredible power. It doesn't mean they have a new heart. It doesn't mean they're a wonderful person inside. In fact, the more they hold on to those rules and regulations, the more miserable, judgmental, and harsh they tend to be in character. But they kept the rules, right? They kept the rules. And that was Paul. He says that when it came to the law, righteous under the law, he said that he was faultless. Now, if you knew anything about the Jewish laws and regulations, of which there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, to be able to claim that under righteousness under the law that he was faultless is an incredible claim to make. It gives you a sense of the power of his will, the determination of this character named Paul. As I mentioned in a Sabbath school class this morning, here's a guy who, when there was a riot in a theater and they all were crying for his death, he said, there's an audience for me to preach to, And the ruler says, we know this, Paul. He's going to look at this as an evangelistic opportunity. So they send word to Paul saying, Paul, we know you're thinking of going there preaching them. Don't do it, okay? And he was constrained to do so. So that's Paul for you. He didn't understand at first until God gave him grace. He didn't understand human weakness. He despised those who did not live up to his standards. He sent away John Mark and refused to have him travel with them. Why? Because John Mark had failed in some way and he wasn't willing to give him a second chance. But you see, God broke Paul and he learned weakness. You know, Paul had incredible visions. He talks about being taken up into heaven and seeing glorious things that he could not even relate on pen and paper. But Paul also had the visions, but he also had physical problems. He calls it a thorn in the flesh that Satan gave to him that God refused to take away. And you know, most likely that weakness that he prayed for God to take away was an eye problem. And again, irony. He was a man who had visions, but he couldn't see very well by day. Right? And he had amazing success. Thousands were converted by his preaching. But he also had persecution, trouble, turmoil, and rejection. Paul learned weakness. And he came to a startling conclusion, one that we should pay attention to. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Turn with me, if you would, 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 9 and 10. And he's just talked here in this passage about the visions that he received. And actually, let's go back a couple verses to verse 7. Why not? He says, or because of these surpassingly great revelations, therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So Paul says, therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses so that Christ's power may rest upon me. He says, look, I'm going to boast about my weaknesses. Now, who does that? You know what? Let me tell you about my failures this week. Yeah. You'll be interested to know about how I messed up. Yeah? No one does that. But he says, look, I boast about my weaknesses in order that I might, what? Take people's attention away from me to the glory of God and his strength and his power, right? So that Christ's power may rest on me. So that is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses and insults and hardships, in persecutions and difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. You see, Paul came to understand grace as real and powerful because he had to come face to face with his own weakness. And unless we come face to face with our own weakness and need, grace will not be our possession. Only then was Christ real to him because he experienced victory where none was possible. It's when you come to the end of your resources and have nowhere to go and nothing to do, and you are lying there in misery, and then God gives you strength. And then you say, God's grace is real. He is forgiven, he is restored, God's grace is real. I could not do it myself, but Jesus did it for me, right? When he experienced weakness and trusted Christ for strength, he experienced the power of God's transforming grace. You see, he says, when I realize my weakness, then I have the opportunity of turning to Christ and say, here I am in my weakness, God, you do something. And Jesus does it. And so it's a paradox here. Through the recognition of his own weakness, he receives strength and power, and he sees it for what it is, a gift of God, a gift of God's grace. When he was weak, then he was made strong, and he gave Christ the credit. This tells us that we need to be patient with people, you know. The church should be a safe place. Really, it should be. The church should be a safe place for people who are struggling in weakness and sorrow, people who are broken. Unless we ourselves, though, have been broken, we will not get it, and will treat each other with contempt and condescension. But if we truly have understood what grace is, then we'll be patient with people, and we'll support people and help people as they themselves are also struggling in weakness. This is not to excuse sin. Of course not. It's to recognize the destructive power of sin and the need we have for God's grace to remedy that problem in our lives. You see, being weak and being made strong is what Jesus did for us, you see. The same Jesus made himself weak. He left the throne of heaven. He left and put aside his divine prerogatives. Philippians 2 said that he emptied himself. He set aside all the power and prerogatives of heaven and became one of us, became weak, being born in a human body, in poverty and shame and contempt as an outcast with nothing. And then he himself walked in the power of God, who gave him victory and used him to save the world, you see. He became weak for us. Isaiah says, what? We despised him. He was rejected. And yet he was the one through whom salvation was wrought for all humanity. In so doing and laying down his life, he opened the way for all to find salvation. And if we depend on his strength, surrendering ourselves to his will, he will make us strong. But we have to come to the point where we say we cannot do it ourselves. Like Paul, we have to say, I thought I was strong, but then I realized I was weak, and I glory in that because then I can see what Jesus is doing. His grace will shape and transform our lives, and we'll become like him, but only if we first recognize we cannot do it by ourselves. There's not one iota of human work in salvation. It's all him. So, if you're sitting there today and you're thinking, well, how could God ever accept me? No matter what you have done, God's grace is available. No matter what the weakness, God's grace can heal. He can take the brokenness of our lives and use it and weave it into a picture of glory that we can have forever as we spend eternity with him. So why not let him? You have nothing to lose except your pride, quite frankly, and everything to gain. The Lord has a gracious, powerful plan for each one of our lives. If we simply come to him and says, Lord, be merciful unto me, a sinner. I recognize my weakness. I need your power if I'm going to be the person that you want me to be, you mean me to be, and so I can be with you in the eternity that you have planned for each one of us. Amen.